Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight we're going to talk about the lost 1950s foods women ate daily. If this is your first time joining us, pull up something soft, find that comfortable position you always settle into when the day finally lets you go, and just breathe for a second. You found the right place, and if you've been here before, genuinely, truly, thank you. You have no idea how much it means that you come back. I read every single comment you leave, every one. I spend hours in there reading all the comments. Tonight, I want to ask you something small before we begin. If what I make here feels worth your time, if this voice and these stories feel like good company for the late hours, would you take just one quiet moment and hit that subscribe button? It costs nothing, and it helps this channel more than I can explain. Now let us get to the real reason you are here. Tonight, we are going somewhere most people have genuinely never thought to look. Not to a battlefield, not to a palace, not to any of the grand dramatic stages where history usually plants its flag. We're going into a kitchen, a specific kind of kitchen, the kind with a rounded refrigerator that hums a little too loudly, and avocado-coloured appliances and a linoleum floor that someone has mopped so many times, the pattern near the sink has nearly rubbed away. We are going into a 1950s American kitchen, and we're going to open every cabinet, peek into every pot, and ask a question that sounds almost too small to be worth asking, but turns out to be one of the most revealing questions you can ask about that entire era. What did women eat? Not what did families eat for Sunday dinner with the good china out. Not what appeared in the glossy photographs of women's magazines where every dish looks like it was assembled by a team of professionals using props instead of food. What did ordinary women actually eat day after day, in that particular decade, in those particular kitchens, living those particular lives? Because the answer is strange and beautiful and a little sad and completely fascinating. And somewhere in it is a story about how the food that Americans eat today became what it is, about how a generation of women was sold a particular dream about modernity and convenience, and what it meant to be a good homemaker, and about what was quietly lost in the exchange. Dim the lights if you can. Let the room go soft. This is going to take a while, and it is worth taking your time with. Let us begin. Picture the year 1952. A woman wakes up in a house in Ohio, or maybe Indiana, or maybe one of those new suburban developments spreading out from the edges of almost every American city like a slow tide of identical lawns and matching mailboxes. The house smells like coffee and something faintly floral, ivory soap probably, and wood from the night's last embers in whatever furnace the house uses. She's been up since before her husband. She's almost always up before her husband. She goes to the kitchen, and this is the first thing I want you to really notice. The kitchen in 1952 is not the kitchen you think it is. It is not the open, airy, brightly lit spaces that dominate American homes today. It is a separate room, a working room, a room designed with a very specific philosophy in mind, which is that one person, almost always a woman, will spend a significant portion of every day in this space performing labour that is invisible to everyone outside it. The refrigerator is on. It is electric, which is still new enough to feel like a luxury to many families. Before the widespread adoption of electric refrigeration, which really only reached most American households in the 1930s and 1940s, food was kept on ice that was delivered by a man with a truck, and the whole system of what you could keep and for how long was completely different. But in 1952, there is a refrigerator humming in the corner, and inside it there are things we would recognise and things we would not. There are eggs. There is almost certainly a bottle of whole milk delivered this morning or yesterday, cream floating at the top. There is butter, real butter, the kind made entirely from cream without any of the modifications that would come later. There might be a pot of something from yesterday, beans or soup sitting in the back covered with a plate. There are probably vegetables that came from somewhere close, maybe a neighbour's garden, maybe the farm stand at the edge of town, maybe the backyard garden that the woman herself tends because that is just what you do. There are no plastic bags. The produce sits loose on the shelves, slightly dusty from whatever soil it came from. And this matters. This matters more than it might seem at first. The food in that 1952 refrigerator is almost entirely whole food. Not whole food in the branded specialty grocery store sense of the word we use today. Whole in the literal sense. It has not been processed, fractionated, reformulated, artificially preserved, or engineered for a longer shelf life. The eggs came from chickens, the milk came from a cow, the butter came from that milk, the vegetables came from the ground, the chain between where the food was and where it is now is short, sometimes extremely short. This is the world we're entering tonight, and one of the things I want to do, gently and slowly and with plenty of room to breathe, is trace what happened to that food. How the 1950s were both a golden moment for certain kinds of eating and the beginning of a long unravelling. How the foods that women ate every day in that decade were in some ways the last gasp of something very old, and in other ways the first steps towards something entirely new and not always better. But before we get to the unravelling, let us spend time in the world itself, because it deserves that. Let us start at the very beginning of the day. Breakfast in a 1950s. American household is a serious matter, not serious in a solemn way, but serious in the sense that it is substantial, it is hot, and it is treated as genuinely important fuel for real physical and mental work. The notion that breakfast should be small or easily skipped has not taken hold yet. The idea of a protein bar eaten while driving has not been invented. Breakfast in 1952 is something you sit down for, at a table, with other people if they're there, and it involves actual cooking. For a woman running a household in this era, breakfast often means eggs. This is the first of the lost daily foods I want to spend time with, because the egg of 1952 is a genuinely different object from the egg of today, and the difference matters in ways that reach all the way into the nutritional profile of what that woman was putting in her body every morning. The chickens that produced eggs in the early 1950s were, by an overwhelming majority, raised on small farms or in backyard flocks. Chickens were kept for their eggs first and their meat second, and they lived lives that involved going outside, scratching in the dirt, eating insects and grass and whatever else they could find, along with whatever grain they were given. This is not a sentimental detail. It has direct nutritional consequences. Eggs from hens that spend time outside in sunlight and eat a varied diet that includes insects and green plants are measurably different from eggs produced by hens kept in confined conditions on uniform grain-based diets. Research conducted much later, well after the era we are talking about, has found that eggs from pasture-raised hens contain significantly higher levels of vitamin D, vitamin E, omega-3 fatty acids, and beta-carotene than factory-farmed eggs. The yolks are a different color entirely, a deep orange gold rather than the pale yellow of conventionally farmed eggs, and that color is not cosmetic. It reflects the presence of carotenoids that the hen absorbed from eating plants and insects. So when the woman in our 1952 kitchen cracks 2 eggs into a cast iron skillet and fries them in a tablespoon of butter, she is consuming something that is nutritionally richer than what passes for the equivalent today, and she has no idea. She is not thinking about omega-3 profiles. She is thinking about whether her husband likes the yolks soft or firm, and whether she has time to make toast before he needs to leave for work. The butter those eggs are fried in deserves its own moment, because the story of butter in the 1950s is tied to one of the most consequential nutritional wrong turns in American history, and it starts in exactly this decade. Real butter is an ancient food. Humans have been making it from cream for thousands of years in dozens of cultures across the world. The butter of 1952 is made from the cream of whole milk, churned until the fat globules clump together and the liquid, the buttermilk, separates out. What remains is mostly fat, yes, but fat of a specific and complex kind, predominantly saturated, which your body knows what to do with, along with fat-soluble vitamins including vitamins A, D, E, and K, and small amounts of conjugated linoleic acid, which later research would find has interesting properties related to inflammation and metabolism. Women in the early 1950s cook with butter almost exclusively. They use it for frying eggs, for spreading on toast, for sautéing vegetables, for finishing sauces, for baking. It is everywhere in the daily diet, and this is not considered alarming. It is just food. It is what food is made of, but the seeds of a change are already being planted. In the late 1940s and through the early 1950s, researchers begin publishing work connecting dietary fat, and specifically saturated fat, to heart disease. The most influential of these researchers is a physiologist named Ancel Keys, who will eventually conduct a major international study comparing diet and cardiovascular disease across multiple countries. His work, and the way it is interpreted and promoted, will spend the next several decades convincing the American public and the medical establishment that saturated fat is dangerous and should be replaced with polyunsaturated vegetable oils. This is the beginning of something. It does not fully arrive in the kitchen of our 1952 woman yet. She is still cooking in butter, still eating it without guilt, still treating it as an ordinary and unremarkable staple. But by the end of the decade, the conversation will be shifting, and by the 1970s and 1980s, it will be shouting. For now, though, the butter is in the pan, and the eggs are sizzling, and the morning smells like it should. Along with eggs, the 1952 breakfast table frequently includes something that has nearly vanished from the daily American diet: whole-grain cooked cereals, not the quick-cooking, pre-sweetened, shelf-stable products that will come to dominate the breakfast aisle, but real cooked oatmeal, made from rolled oats or even steel-cut oats, simmered on the stove with water and a pinch of salt, and served with whole milk poured over the top, maybe a little butter stirred in, maybe a drizzle of molasses or a spoonful of jam. Oatmeal in the early 1950s is a daily staple in millions of American homes. It is what you eat in winter because it is warm and filling and cheap. It is what you eat when someone is sick because it is gentle and sustaining. It is what you make because it is simple and fast enough even on a busy morning, taking maybe 10 minutes on the stove while you do other things. The oats in a 1952 kitchen are likely Quaker rolled oats, which have been on the American market since the 1870s and are about as processed as anything in that kitchen gets. They are steamed and rolled to speed up cooking time, but the grain is still essentially intact. The fiber, the beta-glucan that has later been extensively studied for its effects on cholesterol and blood sugar regulation, the minerals and vitamins present in the whole grain, all of it is still there. And this matters because the woman eating this oatmeal is getting something that modern convenient cereals, which will come to replace it, do not provide in the same way. She is getting slow-digesting carbohydrates that keep her blood sugar stable for hours. She is getting fiber that feeds the beneficial bacteria in her gut. She is getting a meal that takes a few minutes to make and costs almost nothing and provides real, sustained energy for a morning of physical work. Beside the oatmeal, or sometimes instead of it, there might be toast made from actual bread, not bread from a plastic bag filled with 20 ingredients and a shelf life of 3 weeks. Bread from a baker maybe, or homemade bread baked earlier in the week from flour and yeast and water and salt. The loaves of the early 1950s are already beginning to shift away from what they were, because commercial bread production has been expanding since the 1930s, and Wonder Bread, introduced in 1930, has already spent 2 decades convincing Americans that soft, pre-sliced, uniformly white bread is the superior product. But here is the thing about Wonder Bread and its descendants that is worth understanding. The shift to industrially produced white bread is not just a shift in texture or convenience. It is a shift in nutritional content that is significant enough that the United States government will eventually require bread manufacturers to add back in, artificially, the nutrients that were removed in processing. The enrichment of white bread with iron, thiamine, riboflavin, and niacin becomes law in 1943, not because someone decided to make bread healthier, but because the American diet had become so deficient in these nutrients, largely because of the spread of refined white flour, that doctors were seeing the consequences in the bodies of soldiers during the Second World War. So the bread in a 1952 kitchen sits somewhere on a spectrum. Wealthier households and those with a strong homemaking tradition might still bake their own bread from minimally processed flour. Many more are eating commercial white bread, enriched, yes, but still significantly less nutritious than the whole grain bread it replaced. And the conversation about what this matters will not become widespread for decades, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay in the kitchen a little longer, because the most interesting foods of the 1950s daily diet are not the obvious ones. One of the most nutritionally significant things that women in the early 1950s ate regularly, without thinking much about it, without assigning it any special status, is something that has almost completely disappeared from the modern American diet: organ meats. I know. That word lands differently now than it did then. For many modern Americans, organ meats have an exotic or even repellent quality, something adventurous rather than ordinary, something you might order at a restaurant that specializes in nose-to-tail cooking, not something you expect to appear on a Tuesday dinner table. But in 1952, liver is not exotic. Liver is cheap, and it is ubiquitous, and it is considered genuinely healthy food, and it is on the menu in a vast number of American homes at least once a week. Liver and onions is a dish with a long American history. The preparation is simple: sliced calf's liver, or beef liver, or chicken livers, browned in butter or bacon fat with sliced onions until the onions are soft and golden, and the liver is cooked through, seasoned with salt and pepper, sometimes deglazed with a splash of something acidic to balance the richness. It takes maybe 20 minutes. It is economical. It fills the kitchen with a smell that is strong and distinctive and polarizing, which is probably part of why it fell out of fashion. But set that aside for a moment. What liver is, nutritionally, is extraordinary. Gram for gram, beef liver is one of the most nutrient-dense foods that exists. It contains more vitamin A than almost any other food in the preformed version, retinol, which the body can use directly without any conversion. It is extraordinarily rich in B vitamins, including B12, which is found almost exclusively in animal products and is essential for nerve function and red blood cell production. It is a significant source of folate, copper, iron in the highly bioavailable heme form, zinc, and coenzyme Q10. It contains protein of very high quality, meaning all the essential amino acids in good proportion. The woman eating liver once a week in 1952 is getting a nutrient hit that most modern Americans would struggle to replicate with any combination of commonly eaten foods. She is almost certainly not thinking about it this way. She is thinking about stretching the grocery budget, about what her husband will and won't eat, about whether her children will clean their plates. But her body knows. Along with liver, the 1950s daily diet included other organ meats and parts of animals that are now almost entirely absent from mainstream American cooking. Heart was eaten, tough but lean, usually braised slowly until tender, and then sliced thin and served with gravy. Kidney appeared in certain regional and immigrant-influenced recipes, usually in stews or cooked with pie pastry in the British tradition that many American families still carried. Tongue was considered a delicacy and appeared on deli menus and in home kitchens. Tripe, the stomach lining of a cow, was a working-class staple in certain communities, simmered for hours in broth with vegetables. Chicken livers were inexpensive and widely used, fried quickly in butter or made into a pâté of sorts, or cooked with onions and served over egg noodles. Gizzards, the muscular stomach of a chicken, were used to make gravy and stock. Chicken feet went into the soup pot. None of this was considered unusual. It was the way you cooked. It was the way you used the whole animal, because the whole animal cost money, and waste was not something families in the 1950s, many of whom still carried the memory of the Great Depression, were casual about. The disappearance of organ meats from the everyday American diet is one of the most nutritionally significant dietary shifts of the 20th century, and it happened quickly and for reasons that are partly aesthetic, partly industrial, and partly economic in a complicated way. As meat processing became more industrial and centralized through the 1950s and 1960s, the parts of the animal that were not profitable to package attractively and sell at full price began to be diverted to pet food, to processed meat products, to industrial uses. The organ meats became invisible in a market sense, even as they remained abundant in a physical sense. And as they became invisible, they became unfamiliar. And as they became unfamiliar, they became unappetizing to people who had not grown up eating them. A generation grew up in the 1960s and 1970s without the childhood memory of liver and onions on a Friday night, and to that generation, liver was something their parents liked that they had never understood, and by the 1980s it was practically a punchline. We lost something real in that shift. Not something impossible to recover, but something real. Now, let us talk about soup. Soup in the early 1950s deserves its own long, slow conversation, because soup is the central food of that domestic world in a way that is difficult to overstate. Not soup from a can, not yet, or rather not only. The can of Campbell's condensed soup has been on American shelves since 1897 and is already a fixture in 1952. But the soup that matters most in the daily diet of a woman managing a household in this era is homemade, and specifically it is the kind of homemade soup that begins with something that most modern Americans have stopped making entirely: bone broth. Today, bone broth has the slightly breathless quality of a health trend, the kind of thing that appears in the wellness section of a magazine with a price tag that makes you blink. But in the 1952 kitchen, it is not a trend, it is a technique. It is what you do with the bones after the chicken is eaten. It is what makes the soup that gets made on Monday from the Sunday roast chicken a different animal, nutritionally and in terms of flavor, from anything you can produce from a packet or a cube. Here is how it works. After Sunday dinner, after the chicken has been carved and the family has eaten and the plates have been cleared, the carcass of that chicken, the bones and skin and any remaining bits of meat and the giblets if they were not used separately, goes into a large pot. Water is added, enough to cover everything generously. Vegetables go in, half an onion, a few stalks of celery, a carrot or two, maybe a handful of parsley stems, whatever is available and needs to be used. A splash of vinegar, which acidulates the water and helps extract minerals from the bones. And then the pot sits on the back burner at the lowest possible heat, barely simmering for hours, sometimes all day. What happens during those long hours is a kind of slow alchemy. The collagen in the bones and connective tissue gradually breaks down and dissolves into the liquid, converting to gelatin. The marrow inside the bones melts, minerals leach out of the bone matrix into the broth. Amino acids from the connective tissue, notably glycine and proline, become available in concentrated form. If you refrigerate a properly made bone broth, it sets into a wobbly gel. That gelation is the mark of a broth with real body, real substance, real nutrient density. It will melt back to liquid when heated, but while cold it holds its shape. This broth is used for everything. It is the base of the soup that will feed the family for several dinners this week. It is what is used to cook rice or grains, adding a richness and depth that plain water cannot provide. It is sipped on its own, warm, by people who are sick or cold, or just tired in that deep bone way that comes from too much work and not enough rest. It is reduced on the stove and used to make gravy, lush and glossy and tasting entirely of itself. The gelatin in that broth supports gut health, assists in the absorption of the nutrients in the foods eaten alongside it, provides glycine which the body uses in dozens of metabolic processes, including the synthesis of collagen for skin and joints and tissues. The minerals that have leached from the bones are in bioavailable form, meaning the body recognizes and absorbs them readily. None of this is why the woman in the 1952 kitchen is making this broth. She is making it because it is economical, and because it is how her mother made soup, and because wasting the chicken carcass would simply not occur to her. But the nutritional benefit is real and significant, and it is something that will become much harder to obtain as the decades pass and the habit of making broth from bones is gradually abandoned in favor of products that promise the convenience of broth without the labor of making it. The soups built on this foundation are worth describing because they are not the soups most Americans eat today. Chicken noodle soup in a 1952 kitchen starts with that deep golden broth and contains hand-pulled shreds of chicken, vegetables cut into actual pieces large enough to chew and taste, and noodles made from flour and egg, boiled separately and added to the broth at the end so they do not go mushy. The flavor is complex in the way that slow-cooked things always are, layered and rounded rather than sharp and one note. Vegetable beef soup starts with bone-in beef, usually a cheaper cut, simmered until the meat falls from the bones, then built up with whatever vegetables are in season or preserved from the garden. Canned tomatoes from summer, dried beans soaked overnight, potatoes from the root cellar, carrots and onions and celery from the vegetable drawer. This soup is thick and filling and tastes like it took all day to make, because it did. Bean soup, which appears on tables all over the country in this decade, starts with dried beans soaked overnight in cold water, a process that reduces cooking time and also reduces some of the compounds that can cause digestive discomfort. The next day the beans are drained, covered with fresh water, and cooked low and slow with a ham hock or a smoked pork bone for flavor. This produces something fundamentally different from canned beans, which have a different texture and a significantly lower mineral content because the liquid they are canned in has leached much of what the beans contained, and then that liquid is discarded when you drain the can. The dried beans cooked in the 1952 kitchen are not just cheaper than canned, they are nutritionally superior in specific ways. They are higher in resistant starch, a form of starch that the small intestine does not digest and that therefore reaches the large intestine intact, where it feeds beneficial gut bacteria. They retain more of their mineral content. They have a different texture, creamy and dense rather than the uniform softness of canned beans. And the act of soaking and cooking them draws the woman cooking them into a different relationship with the food, one that involves planning, patience, and a certain attention that is simply not possible when you are opening a can. The dried beans of the 1950s come in varieties that have since largely disappeared from mainstream markets. There are Jacob's cattle beans, speckled red and white, grown in New England for generations. There are Anasazi beans, which cook faster than most dried beans and have a slightly sweet, nutty flavor. There are dozens of heirloom varieties of black bean and pinto and navy bean, each with its own specific texture and flavor that makes it suited to certain preparations and not others. By the time this diversity reaches the modern supermarket, most of it has been simplified away in favor of uniformity and long shelf life. Beef features prominently in the 1952 daily diet in ways that differ meaningfully from how Americans eat beef today. The beef of the early 1950s is predominantly grass-finished, not as a health choice, not as a premium product, but simply because that is how cattle are raised. The system of finishing cattle in large feedlots on high-grain diets, which dramatically speeds up their growth and produces the marbled, tender, uniform steaks that modern Americans are accustomed to, is not yet widespread. The beef that goes into a 1952 stew or meatloaf or pot roast came from an animal that spent most of its life eating grass, and the difference this makes to the final product is nutritionally measurable. Grass-finished beef has a higher proportion of omega-3 fatty acids relative to omega-6 fatty acids than grain-finished beef. This ratio matters because the balance between omega-3 and omega-6 fats in the diet influences inflammatory processes throughout the body. Grass-finished beef also contains more conjugated linoleic acid and more beta-carotene, reflected in the slightly yellower color of the fat, and a different vitamin E profile. The flavor is also different, leaner, more mineral, with less of the sweet richness that grain finishing produces, and that American palates came to expect over the following decades. The cuts of beef that appear in the everyday 1952 kitchen are not primarily the premium cuts. They are the economical cuts, the ones that require long cooking to become tender. Chuck, round, shank, brisket. These cuts are from parts of the animal that do a lot of work during the animal's life, which means they have more connective tissue, more collagen, more muscle fiber. They are not suited to quick cooking, they need time. But given that time, in the form of a long braise in the oven or a slow cook on the back burner, they produce something extraordinary. Pot roast, the canonical 1950s Sunday dinner, starts with a tough cut of chuck or bottom round seasoned with salt and pepper and browned well in a Dutch oven until the outside is a deep mahogany color. Then vegetables go in, onions and carrots and potatoes sometimes, a splash of water or broth, and the whole pot goes into a low oven, maybe 300 degrees, for several hours. What emerges is meat that has surrendered its toughness entirely and become silky and falling apart tender, surrounded by vegetables that have absorbed the meaty juices and a natural gravy that has formed from the gelatin released by the collagen in the meat. This technique of long, slow cooking in liquid is called braising, and it is one of the oldest cooking methods humans have used, and it is nutritionally interesting in a specific way. The collagen in the meat converts to gelatin during the braise, just as it does in bone broth, and that gelatin ends up in the cooking liquid, which becomes the gravy or sauce. The woman eating pot roast on Sunday, and then using the leftover braising liquid as the base of soup on Monday, is getting a sustained supply of the glycine and proline that support connective tissue throughout the body. She does not know this. She is just making dinner. Let us move now to something that appears on the table in almost every 1952 American home every single day, in forms that have changed so dramatically that the word connecting them to modern equivalents feels almost inadequate. Bread and butter. Real bread and real butter, eaten together as a side dish with almost every meal, as the foundation of lunch sandwiches, as the snack that tied children over between school and dinner, as the comfort food that appears on the table without anyone having to think about it. The bread question in the 1950s is genuinely complicated because this is a decade of transition. On one end is the homemade bread that was still being made in many households, a whole wheat or mixed grain loaf baked from flour ground from minimally processed grain, leavened with yeast and a little thyme, and tasting of the grain itself in a way that industrial bread never quite manages. On the other end is Wonder Bread, and its many commercial equivalents, soft and white and sweet, and lasting a week on the counter without going stale, which in 1952 still feels like a small miracle to people who grew up watching homemade bread go dry and mold within 2 days. Between these poles is a range of commercial and artisan breads of varying quality: rye bread, sourdough bread, pumpernickel, whole wheat bread from smaller commercial bakeries, Jewish rye bread in urban markets, regional specialties like Hawaiian sweetbread, or the dense German-style bread that still appeared in communities with strong German immigrant heritage. The thing that most of these breads, even the less than ideal ones, share in the 1952 kitchen is that they are fermented. They were made with yeast, which means the dough sat for a period of time during which yeast consumed sugars in the flour and produced carbon dioxide and various organic acids. This fermentation process, which can be short for commercial yeasted bread or very long for sourdough, does something important. It begins to break down some of the anti-nutritional factors in grain, including phytic acid, which binds to minerals like zinc, calcium, and magnesium and prevents their absorption. A properly fermented bread, whether commercial or homemade, delivers more of the minerals in the grain to the body than an unfermented grain product would. The ultra-rapid commercial bread-making process that became standard in the 1960s and 1970s, where dough is processed through a series of mechanical and chemical steps at high speed with very little resting time, largely bypasses this fermentation. The bread that emerges from that process is nutritionally inferior to the slowly fermented bread it replaced, and the difference is significant enough to show up in studies examining mineral status in populations that eat large amounts of industrial bread. But the butter. Let us return to the butter. Butter in 1952 is real butter, full stop. The anti-fat movement has not yet reached the American kitchen with its full force. Margarine exists, and has existed since the late 19th century when it was developed as a cheaper alternative to butter. But margarine in the early 1950s still has a yellow dye stigma. In many states, dairy industry lobbying has resulted in laws prohibiting the pre-coloring of margarine, which means it is sold in its natural white form with a packet of yellow food coloring that the consumer mixes in at home to make it look more like butter. This is not, as you might imagine, a particularly effective way to make people enthusiastic about margarine, but the tides are turning. Through the 1950s, as the low-fat dietary message begins to gather momentum, margarine starts to be reframed not just as a cheaper substitute for butter, but as a healthier one. Made from vegetable oils, high in polyunsaturated fat, low in saturated fat, margarine is positioned by its manufacturers and eventually, controversially, by certain health authorities as the more modern, more heart-healthy choice. What this marketing message does not account for, and what will not be understood for decades, is the problem of trans fats. When liquid vegetable oil is converted into a solid or semi-solid fat suitable for use as a spread, it is put through a process called partial hydrogenation. Hydrogen gas is bubbled through the oil under pressure in the presence of a metal catalyst, causing some of the unsaturated fat molecules to become saturated and changing the physical properties of the oil. The result is a fat that is solid at room temperature, has a long shelf life, and is inexpensive. The problem is that partial hydrogenation also creates a class of fat molecules that do not exist in nature and that the human body does not know how to handle well. These are trans fatty acids, and they are, it will eventually be established beyond reasonable scientific doubt, significantly harmful to cardiovascular health in ways that exceed the risk from natural saturated fats. The woman in the 1952 kitchen who switches from butter to margarine believing she is making a healthier choice is, in terms of her cardiovascular risk, likely making the opposite choice, but she will not know this for decades. The understanding of trans fats and their specific health effects will not become mainstream medical knowledge until the 1990s, and the Food and Drug Administration will not require trans fat labeling on food products until 2006 and will not ban partially hydrogenated oils entirely until 2018. For now, though, the butter sits on the counter in a covered dish and goes on the bread and into the pan and makes everything taste like itself, rich and slightly sweet and completely satisfying, and nobody is worried about it. Lunch in the 1952 daily diet is often simple and fast. For women at home, it is frequently whatever is left over, eaten quickly at the kitchen table between morning chores and afternoon errands. A bowl of yesterday's soup, a sandwich made from leftover pot roast on rye bread with mustard, crackers and a piece of cheddar and a few pickles, a hard-boiled egg with salt. These are not meals that appear in magazine photographs. They are the invisible food of working women's days, practical and nourishing and unremarkable. But there are things about that lunch that are worth noticing. The pickles, for instance. Real pickles in the early 1950s are, in a large number of American households, still fermented pickles rather than the vinegar-brined pickles that dominate the market today. Fermented pickles are made by submerging cucumbers in a salt-water brine and leaving them at room temperature for days or weeks. The salt prevents harmful bacteria from growing while allowing beneficial bacteria, primarily lactobacillus species, to ferment the cucumbers. These bacteria convert sugars in the vegetable into lactic acid, which preserves the pickle and gives it the characteristic sour, complex flavor that distinguishes a good fermented pickle from a jar of vinegar-brined cucumbers. The difference matters because fermented pickles are, effectively, a probiotic food. They contain live beneficial bacteria that, when consumed, add to the population of microorganisms living in the gut. The human gut microbiome, which is the community of trillions of microorganisms that inhabit the large intestine and interact with the immune system, the nervous system, and numerous metabolic processes, is fed and supported in part by the regular consumption of fermented foods containing live cultures. Women in 1952 who eat fermented pickles, sauerkraut, homemade yogurt, naturally leavened bread, aged cheeses, and other traditionally fermented foods are, without knowing it, maintaining their gut microbiome in a way that modern dietary patterns largely fail to do. They are not taking probiotic supplements. They are eating food the way food has been eaten for thousands of years, in forms that incidentally provide the microbial diversity that the gut requires. Sauerkraut in a 1952 kitchen comes in two forms: from a barrel at the delicatessen, tangy and still alive with bacteria, or from a can on the pantry shelf. The canned version has been pasteurized, meaning heated to kill bacteria and extend shelf life, which eliminates the probiotic benefit while retaining the sour flavor. But a significant number of households in the early 1950s, particularly those in communities with strong German, Eastern European, or Pennsylvania Dutch heritage, still keep crocks of homemade sauerkraut in their basements, made from autumn cabbage, packed with salt and left to ferment for weeks until the flavor is exactly right. Homemade yogurt in this era is not called yogurt by most American families. It is called sour milk or klabber or something regional and untranslatable, and it is what happens when whole raw milk sits at room temperature until the natural bacteria in it curdle the proteins into a thick, tangy, slightly funky product that is completely different from the smooth, sweet, fruit-flavored yogurt that will appear in American grocery stores in the 1960s and 1970s. Real fermented dairy from this era is a living food, populated with the specific bacteria that inhabited the milk itself, varied and complex in its microbial profile. This connection to fermented foods is one of the threads that gets quietly cut as the food industry modernizes through the 1950s and 1960s. Pasteurization becomes universal. Fermented products are replicated through vinegar acidification rather than true fermentation. The pickles in the jar at the supermarket are shelf-stable and contain no live cultures. The yogurt on the refrigerated shelf is made by inoculating milk with 2 or 3 specific bacterial strains rather than the dozens that would be present in traditionally fermented dairy. And gradually, without anyone making a conscious decision about it, the regular probiotic input that traditional diets provided more or less by default is lost from the daily eating pattern of most Americans. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the loss is invisible. No one notices it happening in real time. The pickles still taste like pickles, the yogurt still tastes like yogurt, or it does once sugar and fruit are added. The dietary pattern continues to feel normal and adequate because there is no point of comparison visible in daily life. The baseline has shifted quietly in a direction that will not be understood for decades. Let us move to the garden, because in the early 1950s, the vegetable garden is not a hobby. For a very large number of American families, it is a genuine food source, and the foods it produces are qualitatively different from what appears in produce sections today. The home vegetable garden of 1952 contains varieties that have largely been replaced in commercial agriculture by newer cultivars bred for different priorities. The old varieties, the ones that filled seed packets and gardening catalogues in the early post-war years, were selected over generations for flavor, for storability, for adaptability to specific regional climates. A woman in Pennsylvania might grow the same variety of tomato her grandmother grew, a misshapen, cracked-shouldered, deeply red heirloom that is nothing to look at and everything to taste. Modern tomatoes, bred for uniform size and shape, for durability during shipping, for the ability to ripen after picking rather than on the vine, are nutritionally and organoleptically different from those old varieties. Studies comparing lycopene content, which is one of the antioxidant compounds most associated with tomatoes, between modern commercial varieties and older heirloom varieties have generally found the older varieties contain more flavor compounds, which are numerous and complex in a properly vine-ripened heirloom tomato, are diminished in the uniform modern varieties. The tomatoes in a 1952 garden are picked when they are actually ripe because they do not need to travel further than from the backyard to the kitchen. They taste like what tomatoes are supposed to taste like, sweet and acid and deeply savory, with a complexity that comes from a combination of sugars and acids and volatile aromatic compounds that develop fully only when the fruit is allowed to ripen on the plant. They are eaten within hours of picking, not days or weeks later after sitting in a refrigerated transport container. The same logic applies to most of the produce in that garden. Corn picked in the morning and cooked for lunch is measurably sweeter than corn picked in the morning and cooked that evening, because the sugars in corn begin converting to starch the moment the ear is separated from the plant. Summer squash, green beans, cucumbers, lettuce, all of them have a vitality when freshly harvested that fades relatively quickly. The woman who walks out to her garden and cuts what she needs for the day is eating at the peak of nutritional value in a way that no supply chain, however efficient, can quite replicate. This is not sentimentality, this is biochemistry. The vegetables from that garden are also, in 1952, grown without synthetic pesticides, not because organic farming is a philosophy or a marketing category, but because the pesticide revolution has not yet arrived at most home gardens. DDT is in widespread agricultural use, but its application is primarily on commercial farms. The home vegetable garden of 1952 is typically managed with the techniques that have worked for generations: crop rotation, companion planting, hand picking of pests, occasional dusting with natural compounds like diatomaceous earth or copper sulfate. The soil in that home garden is also likely to be in reasonably good health if the household has been maintaining it with compost and organic matter, because the connection between soil health and plant nutrition is one that traditional farmers understood intuitively even before it was articulated in scientific terms. A vegetable grown in soil that has been fed with compost and rotted manure and the slow accumulation of organic matter is drawing minerals and nutrients from a richer medium than a vegetable grown in depleted soil supplemented with synthetic fertilizers that provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium but lack the complex of trace minerals and microbial life that healthy soil contains. Selenium, for instance. The selenium content of food has declined measurably in the United States over the past several decades, and the change is largely attributed to shifts in farming practices. Selenium is not added back to depleted soils by conventional fertilizers. It must be present in the soil in a bioavailable form for plants to absorb it. In regions where the soil has been farmed intensively for many years without appropriate amendment, the selenium available to plants has declined, and consequently the selenium available in the food grown there has declined. The woman in 1952 who grows vegetables in her well-maintained garden is, again without knowing it, getting trace minerals from her food that a modern consumer relying entirely on commercially grown produce may be getting in smaller amounts. Let us talk about dairy, because dairy in the 1952 kitchen is a fascinating and complicated subject. Whole milk, delivered to the doorstep most mornings by the milkman, is drunk by children and adults alike without any notion that the fat in it should be removed or reduced. Skim milk exists and is used, but it is considered an inferior product, what you get when you have taken the cream off the top for something more important. The fat in milk is not considered a threat, it is considered part of the food. And here again, the fat in that whole milk from a mid-century dairy farm is nutritionally different from the fat in modern whole milk in ways that reflect the diet of the cow, a cow grazing on grass and wild plants, which is what most dairy cows were doing in the early 1950s, produces milk that contains higher levels of fat-soluble vitamins, particularly vitamin K2, which is the form of vitamin K that directs calcium to bones and arteries rather than allowing it to calcify in soft tissues. It also contains more conjugated linoleic acid and a more favorable omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than milk from a cow raised primarily on grain in a confined setting. The vitamin K2 story is particularly interesting because it is a nutrient that was not identified and understood until relatively recently, and its functional importance in human health, particularly for bone density and cardiovascular health, was not well characterized until the 1990s and 2000s. But women in the early 1950s who consumed butter, whole milk, and aged cheeses from grass-fed cows were getting meaningful amounts of vitamin K2 in their diets without anyone knowing it was there. The shift to grain-fed dairy production that accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s reduced the vitamin K2 content of dairy products significantly, because the K2 in milk and butter comes from the cow's metabolism of the vitamin K1 that is abundant in green plants, and a cow eating less grass produces less K2. Cheese deserves its own discussion because cheese in a 1952 American home is not the same category of product it is today. The refrigerator in that kitchen likely contains a block of actual aged cheddar, sharp and crumbly and intensely flavored. It might contain a wedge of a locally made farmer's cheese, simple and fresh, slightly tangy, good with bread and tomatoes. In areas with strong immigrant communities, it might contain varieties imported or made domestically in the traditions of Europe: Romano, Parmesan, Swiss, Gouda, Limburger. What it almost certainly does not contain is processed cheese. The processed cheese era is just beginning in the 1950s. Kraft has been selling processed American cheese since 1916, and the individually wrapped processed cheese slice does not appear until 1950. Velveeta, which has been around since 1918, is already a staple of certain kinds of American home cooking, but the idea that these manufactured products are equivalent to real cheese, or superior to it, or more convenient in ways that justify replacement has not yet fully taken hold. Real aged cheese is a fermented food. The bacteria and mold cultures that develop during the aging process, which can take months or years for certain varieties, transform the nutritional profile of the original milk. Aged cheese contains vitamins K2, certain B vitamins, beneficial bacteria in the case of less highly processed varieties, and a complex of flavor compounds that develop only through the slow action of microbial and enzymatic activity. Processed cheese, made by blending cheese with emulsifying salts and other additives, loses most of this character, along with most of the nutritional complexity that comes from the aging process. The cheddar bought in a block from the grocery store in 1952 is a real food with a real history. The cheese product, wrapped in individual plastic, will increasingly come to replace it, not because it is better, but because it is cheaper and more convenient and has a longer shelf life, and because convenience and shelf life are the twin deities of the food industry as it will develop through the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond. Now let us spend some time with something that runs through the entire 1950s daily diet like a quiet thread: cooking fat. The fat in which food is cooked changes the character of the food, and the fats used in a 1952 kitchen are genuinely different from those used today in most American homes. Butter we have already discussed, but along with butter, the 1952 kitchen contains other fats that were once ubiquitous and are now largely gone. Lard. Lard is rendered pig fat, and it has been a cornerstone of American cooking since before there was an America. It is the fat in which generations of biscuits and pie crusts and fried chicken and donuts were made, and the reason it made such exceptional biscuits and pie crusts is related to its specific fat composition. Lard is predominantly monounsaturated and saturated fat, which makes it stable at high temperatures, resistant to oxidation, and excellent for frying and baking. The flakiness of a pie crust made with lard comes from the way solid fat creates layers in the dough that puff when heated, a property that the solid fat must be present in distinct pieces to achieve, which lard does perfectly. The flavor of food cooked in lard is also different, not porky exactly, especially with well-rendered lard, but richer and more complex than food cooked in neutral vegetable oil, which has a very mild flavor that does not contribute much to the character of what is cooked in it. Lard falls out of fashion through the 1950s and 1960s for several reasons. The low-fat, anti-saturated fat message contributes. The marketing of vegetable shortening, particularly Crisco, which was introduced by Procter & Gamble in 1911 and aggressively marketed to American homemakers throughout the 20th century, positions itself as the modern, pure, scientific alternative to animal fat. The advertising for Crisco literally uses the word pure as a contrast to animal lards, which were characterized as something old-fashioned and industrial and impure, which is rather extraordinary considering that Crisco is made through the partial hydrogenation of cottonseed oil and contains, in its original form, large amounts of trans fats. But the transformation of Crisco from a cottonseed oil product, created to use a cotton industry byproduct, into a kitchen staple, is one of the great marketing successes of American food history, and it is directly tied to the simultaneous marginalization of lard. By the time the 1950s are well underway, many American women are using Crisco for baking and cooking in the sincere belief that they are making a healthier choice, while their grandmother's lard sits in a can on the shelf, used for the occasional batch of fried chicken, regarded with some vague sense of guilt. The other cooking fat that was still common in 1952 but would not survive the decade intact is bacon grease. Every kitchen that cooks bacon, which is most American kitchens in this era, has a grease can sitting near the stove. When bacon is cooked, the rendered fat that remains in the pan is poured into this can and kept at room temperature or near the stove for constant use. It is used to fry eggs, to season cast iron, to start the cooking of vegetables, to flavor beans, to fry cornbread in the skillet. It has a smoky, salty, deeply savory flavor that contributes enormously to the character of everything cooked in it. The practice of saving and using bacon grease is both economical and, in the nutritional context of what we now understand about different fats, not necessarily harmful. Pork fat is predominantly monounsaturated, which is the same fat category as olive oil, often cited as a cornerstone of the heart-healthy Mediterranean diet. The saturated fat in bacon grease is primarily stearic acid, which research suggests has a neutral effect on LDL cholesterol. The smoky flavor compounds in cured and smoked bacon fat are separate from the fat's nutritional properties, but bacon grease, like lard, carries the stigma of being an animal fat in an era that is beginning to demonize animal fats, and gradually it disappears from kitchen counters across America, replaced first by Crisco, then by various hydrogenated vegetable shortenings, then by refined vegetable oils like soybean oil and corn oil, which will come to completely dominate the American cooking fat landscape by the 1970s and 1980s. The shift from animal fats to industrially refined vegetable oils is one of the most significant dietary changes of the 20th century, and it is not a change that has improved the health of the American population. The dominance of omega-6 rich oils like soybean and corn oil in the American diet has contributed to a dietary omega-6 to omega-3 ratio that is dramatically higher than that of any traditional human diet, and this imbalance is associated with a range of inflammatory conditions. The trans fats in partially hydrogenated vegetable oils have caused, according to various research estimates, tens of thousands of cardiovascular disease deaths per year in the United States. These are consequences that were not anticipated in the 1950s, and they are consequences of a dietary shift that was sold to the American public as an improvement. We have been spending a lot of time in the main meal categories. Let me take you somewhere a little different now, to the edges of the daily diet, to the foods that appear between meals and in small ways throughout the day, because these incidental foods are sometimes where the most interesting things live. In the late morning, a woman managing a household in 1952 might sit down for coffee, and with the coffee she might eat something simple, a piece of fruit, an apple or a pear from the bowl on the counter, or a cookie she made herself from butter and flour and sugar and vanilla, or a slice of the cake sitting under a glass dome on the kitchen counter. The fruit. Let us talk about the fruit. The apple in the fruit bowl in a 1952 kitchen is, in most parts of the country, a local variety. Not a local variety in the sense of a small batch specialty product available only at a farm stand. A local variety in the sense that there are hundreds of apple varieties being grown commercially in different regions of the country, and the ones available in a given market are determined largely by geography and what grows well in that region. The American apple landscape in the early 1950s is still immensely diverse. Macintosh in the northeast, where it was bred and where it grows magnificently in the cool climate. Jonathan and Cortland in the Midwest, Golden Delicious in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, Gravenstein in California and Oregon, Rome and Stayman and York Imperial, and a dozen other varieties in the Appalachian and Mid-Atlantic regions. This diversity reflects hundreds of years of apple growing and breeding, with varieties adapted to specific climates and soils, each with its own particular balance of sugars and acids and aromatic compounds. By the end of the 20th century, this diversity will have collapsed dramatically. The Red Delicious, bred and promoted primarily for its appearance, its glossy red skin and perfect shape, will come to dominate American apple production and consumption. And the Red Delicious is arguably the worst-tasting commercial apple ever widely grown, thick-skinned and mealy, and lacking the balance of sweet and tart that makes an apple enjoyable. It is beautiful to look at and unpleasant to eat, and its ascendancy over the American apple market is a perfect parable for what happens when aesthetic uniformity becomes the primary selection criterion in food production. But in 1952, the apple in the fruit bowl might be a Macintosh if you are in New England, tart and aromatic and slightly fragile, best eaten fresh because it does not keep long. It might be a Jonathan, which has a lovely spicy complexity that makes it extraordinary in a pie. It might be a Gravenstein in California, thin-skinned and honey-sweet and vanishingly perishable. Whatever it is a real apple, chosen for flavor and grown relatively close to where it is being eaten, and it has a range of phytochemical complexity that reflects its specific genetics and the specific soil and climate in which it was grown. The baked goods sitting on the counter in that 1952 kitchen deserve a moment of honest attention because they exist in a complicated relationship with the health conversation. The woman who baked that cake made it from real ingredients: flour, butter, eggs, sugar, vanilla, milk, baking powder. These are all whole or minimally processed ingredients. The sugar is refined white sugar, which has been a staple of American baking for a very long time and is not nutritionally interesting in itself, but the other ingredients have properties that industrial baking cannot replicate. The eggs and butter contribute fat-soluble nutrients. The whole milk adds protein and calcium. The vanilla is probably real vanilla extract rather than synthetic vanillin. What the homemade cake does not contain is any of the ingredients that will come to characterize commercial baked goods as the food industry develops: artificial colors, artificial flavors, emulsifiers to extend shelf life, preservatives to prevent mold, high fructose corn syrup as a cheaper sweetener, partially hydrogenated oils in place of butter. These additives will not arrive en masse until the 1960s and beyond, but their arrival is already being prepared by the industrialization of food production that is accelerating through the 1950s. The homemade cake is also a food that requires skill to make well, and that skill is transmitted through practice. The woman who bakes this cake knows, from making it many times, how the batter should look and feel, how the cake should smell as it bakes, how a toothpick inserted in the center should come out when it is done. This embodied knowledge, this skill at cooking from scratch, is one of the things that will be quietly lost as convenience foods increasingly offer alternatives to the labor of cooking from basic ingredients. If you never learn to bake a cake because you can always buy one or open a box mix, you lose not just the skill, but the relationship with the ingredients, the understanding of what sugar does in a batter versus in a frosting, what happens when you substitute buttermilk for whole milk, why butter at room temperature creams differently from cold butter. This knowledge is not particularly useful in an abstract sense, but it is part of a broader food literacy that enables a person to cook flexibly, adaptively, from whatever is available, rather than being dependent on specific processed products to produce specific outcomes. That food literacy, widespread in 1952, will erode steadily through the following decades as cooking education shifts from practical home instruction to following recipes printed on the backs of boxes, and as the expectation that cooking requires skill and time and knowledge is replaced by the promise that it can be fast and easy and require nothing more than opening a package. Now, I want to take you deeper into one of the most significant stories in this whole history because it connects the 1950s daily diet to something happening outside the kitchen, in boardrooms and laboratories and advertising agencies that will change what Americans eat for the rest of the century. The story of processed food. Industrial food processing is not new in the 1950s. Canning has been practiced commercially since the early 19th century. Crackers and biscuits have been manufactured at industrial scale since before the Civil War. Breakfast cereal was invented in the 1860s and 1870s, most famously by John Harvey Kellogg at his Battle Creek Sanitarium. Coca-Cola and various other carbonated beverages have been sold since the 1880s. But the 1950s represent an inflection point, a moment when the pace and scale of food industrialization accelerates dramatically, driven by several converging forces. The first is technology. The Second World War generated enormous investment in food preservation and processing technologies because feeding armies requires shelf-stable, portable, calorie-dense foods. Many of these technologies become available for civilian food production after the war, and the food industry, flush with post-war prosperity and entrepreneurial energy, applies them vigorously. The second is marketing. Television advertising, which becomes widespread in American homes through the early 1950s, creates a new and extraordinarily powerful channel for reaching consumers directly with emotional, aspirational messages about food. Companies can now advertise not just a product, but an idea about what cooking and eating should look like, and they use this power deliberately and effectively. The third is the cultural context we have already touched on, the positioning of convenience as a virtue, as modern and sophisticated and liberating, in contrast to the labor of traditional cooking from scratch. The fourth is the simultaneous de-skilling of the housewife. This is a term that sociologists use to describe the deliberate erosion of traditional domestic skills through the promotion of products that replace them. If you can buy a ready-made pie crust in a package, you do not need to know how to make pie crust. If you can buy a can of condensed soup to form the base of a casserole, you do not need to know how to make a flavorful sauce or broth. If you can mix up a packet of dry gravy mix with water, you do not need to know how to make pan gravy from drippings. These are not necessarily bad things individually. The problematic element is the aggregate effect over decades, which is a population increasingly unable to cook from basic ingredients and therefore increasingly dependent on industrial food products. The Betty Crocker Cookbook, first published in 1950, is an interesting document in this context. It is one of the most influential American cookbooks of the 20th century, and it sits exactly at the inflection point between traditional scratch cooking and the convenience food era. Many of its recipes are genuinely instructive, teaching actual cooking techniques, but it also enthusiastically incorporates canned soups and packaged mixes as legitimate ingredients, normalizing their use in a way that accelerates their penetration into everyday cooking. The arrival of Jell-O as a dinner staple, rather than merely a dessert, is a perfect artifact of 1950s food culture. Gelatin salads, which reached their peak in American domestic cooking somewhere in the middle of the decade, are aspic-style dishes made with flavored gelatin powder mixed with water and set with various fillings: shredded carrots and celery, canned fruit cocktail, cream cheese, olives, cooked vegetables, even meat. They appear on the tables of women's luncheons and church potlucks and family dinners, served on a bed of lettuce with a dollop of mayonnaise, taken seriously as sophisticated entertaining fare. The gelatin salad is fascinating for several reasons. It represents the enthusiasm for new food science and novel products that characterize the post-war decade. It represents the integration of processed convenience foods into the domestic repertoire of respectable American homemaking. and it represents a use of a genuinely nutritious ingredient, gelatin, which is protein derived from animal collagen and contains many of the same beneficial amino acids as bone broth, in a form that is simultaneously modern and nostalgically home-cooked. The jello in the molded salad is not nutritionally trivial. The sugar in the flavored varieties is less ideal, but unflavored gelatin, which was also used and which contributed to the firm structure of homemade aspics and certain sauces, is a real nutritional food. The Campbell's soup can is perhaps the most iconic processed food of the decade. By 1952, Campbell's condensed soups are deeply embedded in American domestic cooking, not primarily as a canned soup to be eaten as soup, though that happens too, but as an ingredient in casseroles and sauces and dips. The combination of Campbell's condensed cream of mushroom soup with green beans and French fried onions becomes the iconic green bean casserole, created in 1955 by a Campbell's Soup Company home economist named Dorcas Riley. It is invented as a recipe designed to sell more soup, and it works brilliantly, becoming one of the most made dishes on American Thanksgiving tables to this day. The cream of mushroom soup used in that casserole is a convenience ingredient in the truest sense. It provides a creamy, savory sauce base without requiring the cook to make a bechamel from butter and flour and milk, or to sauté fresh mushrooms and reduce stock to make a mushroom sauce. The time and skill savings are real, so is the nutritional trade-off. The canned soup is high in sodium, contains modified food starch and other thickeners that do not add nutritional value, lacks the fat-soluble nutrients that a butter-based sauce would provide, and has a flavor that is significantly less complex than a properly made mushroom cream sauce. None of this makes it bad food. It makes it processed food, which is a category defined less by inherent harm and more by the systematic replacement of whole food ingredients with engineered ingredients designed primarily for convenience, shelf stability, and cost efficiency rather than nutritional density. The distinction that does not get made often enough is between convenient preparations of real food and products that are engineered substitutes for real food. Canned tomatoes, for instance, are a convenient preparation of real food. Tomatoes, preserved in their own juice, with nutritional properties that in some ways exceed fresh tomatoes because the canning process releases lycopene from the cell walls and makes it more bioavailable. Canned cream of mushroom soup is a product engineered to provide the sensory properties of a cream sauce without the ingredients or the process of actually making one. Both are useful. One is nutritionally superior. The food industry of the 1950s is becoming very good at blurring this distinction, and it will spend the following decades perfecting the blurring. The goal is to make processed food products feel as much as possible like home cooking, to borrow the emotional resonance of made-from-scratch food while delivering the profit margins of manufactured products. And the woman at the center of all this, the housewife in her kitchen managing a household on a budget with a family to feed, is simultaneously the target, the agent, and in some ways the victim of this process. She is targeted by advertising that positions processed convenience foods as modern, smart, and labor-saving. She is the agent who decides what comes into her home and what gets put on the table. And she is, in many cases, being asked to trade something real for something manufactured without being told clearly what the trade involves. Now let us move through the day a little further and come to something that is one of the richest and most interesting areas of 1950s daily food, the evening meal. Dinner in a 1952 American household is the main social event of the day, the meal around which the family assembles, and it is in many households a genuinely substantial production. Women who have been managing households all day turn their full attention to dinner in the late afternoon, and what they produce reflects not just culinary skill, but a kind of domestic artistry that at its best was remarkable. We have talked about pot roast. Let us talk about a few other things that appeared on the daily dinner table in ways that have since largely vanished. Stewed tomatoes with bread. This sounds almost absurdly simple, but it was a real daily food in many American households in the early 1950s, particularly in summer when the garden was producing more tomatoes than could be eaten fresh. The preparation is as direct as the name suggests. Fresh or canned tomatoes simmered in butter or bacon fat with a little onion and salt and sugar until the tomatoes have broken down into a thick, sweet, savory stew. This is then ladled over thick slices of white bread or toast, which absorb the liquid and become something soft and deeply satisfying. The tomatoes in this dish are an excellent source of lycopene, particularly after cooking, which releases lycopene from the cell matrix and makes it more accessible. The fat in which they are cooked, butter or bacon fat, facilitates the absorption of this fat-soluble antioxidant. The bread provides carbohydrate and some protein. The whole thing together is filling and nutritious and costs almost nothing if the tomatoes come from the garden. It is also delicious in the specific way that simple, well-executed things are delicious, completely honest about what it is, delivering nothing but what it promises. This kind of simple evening supper, built from a few basic ingredients cooked with skill and care, appears in various forms throughout the weekly dinner rotation of a 1952 household. Fried cornmeal mush with maple syrup, eggs scrambled soft in butter with toast and sliced tomatoes, baked potatoes with sour cream and chives. These are not glamorous. They do not appear in the magazine photographs of aspic-molded showstoppers and elaborate casseroles, but they are real food, made from whole ingredients, eaten with genuine appetite after a day of physical work. The potato deserves particular attention here, because the potato's role in the daily 1952 diet is considerably different from its role in the modern diet, and the difference is nutritionally significant. In 1952, the potato is a serious staple, not a side dish in the modern sense, where it is often optional and sometimes interchangeable with rice or pasta or quinoa, but a foundational element of the daily meal, present at dinner virtually every night in one form or another: boiled, mashed, roasted, baked, fried in the skillet, cooked in a gratin with cream and cheese. The varieties of potato available in 1952 are also different. The russet Burbank, which will eventually come to completely dominate American potato production because of its excellent qualities for making French fries and its consistent industrial yield, is already widely grown, but it sits alongside a much larger range of varieties: yellow Finns, creamy and buttery flavored; red Pontiac, waxy and holding its shape in a potato salad; Kennebec, an all-purpose workhorse with excellent flavor; fingerlings of various types; Peruvian purple potatoes, which will not become fashionable for decades but are available in communities with Andean heritage. The potato is nutritionally more interesting than it is given credit for. It is a reasonable source of vitamin C, potassium, and B vitamins, particularly when the skin is eaten. It contains resistant starch, especially when cooked and cooled, which, as we discussed with beans, feeds gut bacteria. It provides complex carbohydrates that digest relatively slowly when eaten in their whole form, providing sustained energy rather than the spike and crash of refined carbohydrates. What the potato is not in 1952 is anything like a French fry, or rather, it is a French fry only occasionally, when sliced thin and fried in lard or butter at home, a labor-intensive preparation that is a special treat rather than a daily food. The French fry is a dietary staple, eaten multiple times per week as a processed fast food produced from russet potatoes in industrial quantities, fried in partially hydrogenated soybean oil. Does not exist in 1952 except at an early handful of drive-in restaurants, and even there it is not eaten daily. The transformation of the potato from a nutritious whole food daily staple to a processed commodity most frequently consumed as fast food French fries or potato chips or instant mashed potato from a box is one of the most nutritionally consequential shifts in the American diet of the 20th century. It is a shift that extracts the potato from its context of whole food cooking and inserts it into a context of industrial processing, high heat and unstable refined oils, added salt and artificial flavors, which changes both its nutritional profile and its relationship to daily eating in ways that are largely disadvantageous. But in 1952, the potato sits in a bin in the pantry or root cellar. It is bought in 20-pound bags from the grocery or grown in the garden. It is peeled and cooked from scratch every day. It is real food, eaten as real food. Let us talk about something that I think is one of the most striking differences between the 1950s daily diet and today's: the absence of snacking as a lifestyle. Modern Americans eat constantly. Food is available at all times in all places. Office desks have candy bowls. Movie theaters sell enormous quantities of food that is consumed alongside rather than instead of a meal. Beverages containing significant calories, from sweetened coffee drinks to sports drinks to sodas, are consumed throughout the day as a matter of course. children are given snacks as a standard part of the schedule multiple times between meals. In 1952, this pattern is not yet the norm. Meals in the early 1950s have a structure. Breakfast is at a defined time, usually early. Lunch is at midday. Dinner is in the early evening. Between these meals, most households do not provide food. If a child says they are hungry between meals, they are told to wait for the next meal or given a piece of fruit. Snacking as a concept exists, but is not built into the schedule or considered essential to normal functioning. This eating pattern, in which the body regularly experiences several hours without food between meals, has physiological consequences that are, from a metabolic standpoint, generally positive. The periods between meals allow insulin levels to fall, which facilitates fat oxidation. The digestive system has time to complete processing one meal before the next begins. Hunger, when it comes, is a clear signal rather than a constant background noise. Meals, when they arrive, are eaten with real appetite. The constant eating pattern of modern American life, which will develop through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, driven by the food industry's interest in selling more food more often, disrupts this natural rhythm. It keeps insulin elevated more continuously, interferes with the body's natural signals of hunger and satiety, and encourages a relationship with food that is less about genuine nourishment and more about constant sensory stimulation. The 1952 woman who eats 3 substantial meals and nothing in between, not because she is deliberately practicing intermittent fasting as a health strategy, but simply because that is how eating worked, is experiencing a pattern that her body is evolutionarily well adapted to and that supports stable blood sugar and healthy metabolism in ways she will never need to think about. Now I want to take you somewhere specific and a little surprising, to a food that was eaten every day by many American women in 1952 and that has since become either demonized or fetishized beyond recognition: fat. Not fat in general, full-fat dairy. The cream, the sour cream, the whole milk ricotta, the farmer's cheese made from whole milk that appeared on dinner tables and in cooking pots throughout this decade as an unremarkable daily ingredient. Full-fat dairy in the 1952 kitchen is used without apology. Sour cream goes into stroganoff, into borscht, into dips served with crackers at parties, dolloped onto baked potatoes. Heavy cream goes into soups to enrich them, into sauces to finish them, into desserts where it is whipped by hand or with a mixer into soft clouds. Cream cheese is used in frostings and cheesecakes and as a spread on crackers. Ricotta, in Italian-American households, fills pasta and goes into various pastries and is eaten simply with honey and bread. These dairy fats are not the nutritional problem they will be labeled as through the 1970s and 1980s. Full-fat dairy contains a complex of nutrients, including fat-soluble vitamins and the conjugated linoleic acid we discussed earlier, that is disrupted when the fat is removed. Low-fat dairy substitutes for full-fat versions in many applications, but the resulting products are often supplemented with various additives to restore the texture and mouthfeel that fat provides, and the overall nutritional profile is arguably less coherent. The fat in full-fat dairy is also satiating in a way that low-fat versions are not. This matters for the overall diet because satiation, the feeling of genuine fullness, is what tells the body to stop eating. A meal that is genuinely satisfying reduces the desire to eat again in an hour, while a meal that is low in fat but high in rapidly digested carbohydrates may produce a temporary feeling of fullness followed by a rapid return of hunger. The low-fat dietary movement, which will gather significant force through the 1970s and 1980s, will encourage the replacement of full-fat dairy with low-fat and non-fat versions, and will simultaneously encourage the replacement of fat calories in the diet with carbohydrate calories. Given that the carbohydrate calories most Americans replaced fat with came from refined grains and added sugars rather than from whole food carbohydrates like legumes and vegetables, this substitution had consequences for the American diet that were not positive. The obesity epidemic and the type 2 diabetes epidemic of the late 20th century unfolded during precisely the decades when the low-fat dietary message was dominant, which is not a simple causal story, but is not a coincidence either. In 1952, though, the sour cream is still in the refrigerator and nobody feels guilty about it. Let me take you now to one of the most nutritionally interesting corners of the 1952 daily diet, something that appears so regularly and in such variety that it constitutes a significant and largely irreplaceable category of nutrition that has since been dramatically reduced in the everyday American eating pattern. Legumes. Dried beans and peas and lentils in all their variety are a daily food in the early 1950s in a way that is hard to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. Not daily in the sense of eaten at every meal, but daily in the sense of present in the weekly meal rotation with a frequency and prominence that simply does not exist for most modern American families. Navy bean soup, made with small white beans soaked overnight and cooked with a ham bone until the beans are falling apart and the broth has become thick and starchy and deeply savory. Split pea soup, made with green or yellow split peas that need no soaking and cooked down into a smooth, dense, velvety soup that is extraordinarily filling. Lentil soup with onions and carrots and a splash of vinegar. Baked beans, a New England institution, made with navy beans cooked slowly in an earthenware pot in the oven for hours with molasses and salt pork and dry mustard until they are sweet and smoky and almost creamy. Black-eyed peas cooked with greens in southern households, a combination that is nutritionally excellent as well as traditionally significant, since the greens provide iron that the vitamin C in certain preparations helps the body absorb, and the legumes provide protein that complements the amino acid profile of grains. Chili made with dried pinto beans or kidney beans cooked from scratch. Hopping John, the rice and black-eyed pea dish of the South. Bean and ham soup from Great Northern beans. Lima bean succotash with corn. These legume-based dishes are cheap, filling, and nutritionally extraordinary. They are among the most fiber-dense foods in the human diet, and the specific types of fiber in legumes, including various forms of soluble fiber, function as prebiotics, food for the beneficial bacteria in the gut. They are excellent sources of plant protein, providing a range of amino acids that, when combined with grains as traditional cuisines around the world intuitively discovered, produce a complete amino acid profile. They are high in folate, in iron, in magnesium, in potassium, in zinc, in B vitamins. Legumes in traditional diets are also generally prepared in ways that maximize their nutritional availability. The overnight soaking that precedes cooking reduces phytic acid content, increases mineral bioavailability, and reduces cooking time. The long, slow cooking that most dried bean preparations require ensures that complex starches are fully cooked and digestible. The combination with acidic ingredients like tomatoes or vinegar that appears in many traditional bean recipes may further assist in mineral absorption. The movement away from dried legumes as everyday food that will accelerate through the 1960s and 1970s is driven by convenience. Canned beans require no soaking and no long cooking, and they are available in a form that can be incorporated into a meal in minutes rather than hours. But canned beans are nutritionally inferior to properly cooked dried beans in several ways, and the reduction in legume consumption overall, as processed foods increasingly fill the spaces that bean dishes used to occupy in the weekly meal plan, is one of the contributors to the fiber deficit that characterizes the modern American diet. The average American adult today consumes approximately 15 grams of dietary fiber per day. The recommended intake is 25 to 38 grams. Hunter-gatherer populations and traditional agricultural societies have fiber intakes estimated at 50 to 100 grams per day. The woman eating beans and lentils and split pea soup and baked beans multiple times per week in 1952, alongside her homemade bread and fresh vegetables, is considerably closer to that traditional fiber intake than most modern Americans, and the health consequences of this difference are substantial. Something that runs throughout all of this that I want to name explicitly, because I think it is the most important thing to say, is that the diet we have been describing is not described by anyone in 1952 as a health diet. Nobody is eating beans and bone broth and whole vegetables because they read about the benefits in a wellness magazine. They are eating this way because it is how food works. It is how their mothers cooked, and how the economy of the household has always functioned, and how the ingredients available to them naturally combine. The nutritional excellence of this diet is an emergent property of practical cooking, not a deliberate health strategy. This is worth sitting with for a moment. We live in an era in which eating healthfully has become a project, something that requires research and intention and the navigating of competing dietary philosophies and the purchasing of specific superfoods and supplements. And yet the diet of the ordinary 1952 housewife, assembled from practical necessity and traditional habit, is in many ways nutritionally superior to the carefully optimized diets of health-conscious modern consumers. What does that tell us? It tells us that somewhere in the 50 or 60 years between that 1952 kitchen and now, something went seriously wrong with the relationship between everyday people and whole food. And the story of what went wrong is the story of the industrialization of the American food supply, the rise of processed and ultra-processed food products, the decline of home cooking skills, the triumph of convenience and marketing over nutrition and tradition. It is a story that happens slowly, across decades, driven by forces that are largely invisible to the people experiencing them. Nobody in 1955 decides to stop eating bone broth and start eating processed soup. Nobody in 1965 decides to stop cooking dried beans and start opening cans. Nobody in 1975 decides that vegetables from the garden are too much trouble and that frozen processed vegetable products are just as good. Each individual choice, each individual product adoption, each individual shortcut seems small and reasonable and even positive in the moment. The aggregate effect, measured across a population over decades, is a dietary shift of enormous consequence. One of the things I find most striking about the 1950s food world, particularly when thinking about women's daily eating, is how much of what was eaten came from two sources that have largely disappeared from the daily diet of most Americans: the home garden and the local farm. The home vegetable garden is a serious matter in the early 1950s, not a hobby, not a therapeutic pastime, not a small raised bed producing herbs for weekend cooking, a genuine food source, tended with real effort, planned with thought for what the family will eat through the year. The Victory Garden program of World War II, which encouraged American civilians to grow their own vegetables as a patriotic contribution to the war effort, had by 1943 resulted in approximately 20 million home gardens, producing roughly 40% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. The program ended with the war, but the gardens did not immediately disappear. Many families that had started vegetable gardens during the war years continued them afterward, partly from habit, partly from the recognition that homegrown food was genuinely better and cheaper than store-bought. By 1952, a substantial percentage of American households still maintained some form of kitchen garden. In rural and semi-rural areas, this might be quite extensive, several hundred square feet of vegetables, plus perhaps a few fruit trees and berry bushes and herbs. In suburban areas, the post-war housing boom is filling in the garden space with lawns and driveways, but many women still maintain a kitchen garden even in the new suburbs, growing tomatoes and beans and lettuce in whatever space is available. What these gardens produce is food of a quality that the commercial produce system struggles to replicate, varieties chosen for flavor rather than shipping durability, grown in soil that is known and tended, harvested at the moment of peak ripeness, eaten without the delay and cold storage that commercial distribution requires. The nutritional gap between garden-fresh vegetables and commercially grown produce begins at the harvest moment and widens with every day of storage and transport. The relationship between women and this garden is also worth considering for a moment, because it is not merely a relationship of labor and production, it is also a relationship of knowledge. The woman who tends a vegetable garden develops an understanding of how plants grow, what they need, how they respond to weather and soil, when they are ready to harvest, how to save seeds for next year, how to deal with pests and diseases using the tools available. This knowledge, accumulated over years and transmitted from generation to generation, is a form of food literacy that sits alongside and complements the knowledge of cooking. Together they constitute a complete understanding of food from seed to plate that is increasingly rare in the modern world. The disappearance of the home vegetable garden from the mainstream American domestic experience is a gradual process that accelerates through the 1960s and 1970s as suburban lots shrink, as the time available for gardening decreases as more women enter the paid workforce, and as the availability and affordability of commercial produce improve to the point where growing your own food no longer seems economically necessary. But with the garden goes a kind of knowledge and a kind of relationship with food that cannot be replaced by a trip to the supermarket produce section. The local farm is the other source. In 1952, the food supply chain is considerably shorter and more local than it will become. Most milk comes from dairy farms within a few hundred miles. Much produce comes from farms within the state or the region. Eggs come from local farms, often quite small ones. Chicken comes from local producers who may well be known by name. The farmer's market and the farm stand are not specialty options for the food-conscious consumer. They are simply where food comes from. This localism is partly logistical, a function of the limitations of refrigeration and transportation technology of the era, but it has nutritional consequences regardless of its cause. Food that has traveled less distance and spent less time between harvest and consumption is in general more nutritious than food that has spent days or weeks in transit and cold storage. The vitamin C content of vegetables decreases during storage. The volatile aromatic compounds that make fresh produce appealing and flavorful degrade over time. The biological activity of certain nutrients diminishes. The consolidation of the American food supply, which accelerates dramatically from the 1960s onward, produces a system where produce might travel thousands of miles from farm to consumer and spend a week or more in refrigerated storage before being sold. This system delivers enormous diversity and year-round availability and generally lower prices, which are genuine benefits, but it also delivers food that is, at the moment of consumption, nutritionally and organoleptically different from what the 1952 household obtained from local sources. Let us turn now to something that I think is one of the most emotionally resonant aspects of the 1950s daily food world, and that is its seasonality. The eating of the early 1950s is deeply seasonal in a way that modern eating is not, and may never again be in quite the same way, because the commercial food system has spent 70 years systematically eliminating the seasons from the produce aisle. In a 1952 kitchen, you eat strawberries in June when they ripen locally and not in January, because there are no strawberries in January, or if there are, they are imported from somewhere far away and are neither good nor interesting. You eat corn in August, when it comes sweet and local from nearby farms, and you eat it so many times in those August weeks that by September you are almost tired of it, which means you arrive at the following August with a genuine anticipation that has been building for 11 months. You eat apples in the fall and through the winter, varieties chosen for their keeping qualities. You eat parsnips and turnips and winter squash and stored potatoes through the cold months, because these are the vegetables that survive storage, and you eat them in the forms that make them most interesting. Parsnips roasted until they caramelize, turnips mashed with butter and cream, winter squash baked with maple syrup, potatoes cooked in their skins. This seasonal rhythm creates a relationship with food that is qualitatively different from the modern relationship, where everything is available always and nothing is particularly special. When strawberries come in June, they are genuinely exciting. They are the signal that summer has arrived. They taste extraordinary not just because they are ripe and local, but because they have been absent for 11 months, and their return is anticipated and celebrated. The first tomato of summer is an event. The last sweet corn of the season is bittersweet. This cycle of anticipation and arrival and abundance and absence is a natural structure for the year's eating that connects people to the rhythms of growing and harvest and season in a way that constant availability cannot replicate. It also ensures variety over the course of the year. Different foods at different seasons means different nutrients, different flavors, a natural rotation through the range of what the land produces. The loss of this seasonal rhythm is one of the quieter losses in the modern food experience. Not the loss of nutrients exactly, since the food that arrives in supermarkets year-round is generally edible and reasonably nourishing, but the loss of the particular emotional and sensory texture of eating according to the season, the way certain foods become associated with specific times of year and specific feelings and specific memories. Watermelon in the heat of a July afternoon. Pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving when pumpkins have been growing since spring and are now finally at their peak. The first asparagus of spring, so eagerly awaited after months without fresh vegetables, cooked simply in butter and eaten while standing at the stove because you simply cannot wait. These experiences require absence to have their full meaning, and constant availability erases the absence. Let me take you now to something that deserves its own careful attention, because it represents one of the deepest tensions in the 1950s food story: convenience. The food industry's primary sales pitch to American women in the 1950s is built on the promise of convenience, and this pitch is not dishonest in its premise. Managing a household in 1952 is genuinely labor-intensive. Cooking 3 meals a day from scratch, for a family of 4 or 5, without many of the labor-saving technologies we take for granted, takes real time and energy. A woman who is also managing children, maintaining a home, handling household administration, managing the family's social obligations, and possibly doing part-time paid work, is a woman for whom time is genuinely scarce. The food industry, watching this situation, sees an opportunity. If it can produce products that reduce the time and effort required to put food on the table, women will buy those products, and the food industry will profit from selling them. This is the logic that drives the development of packaged cake mixes, frozen TV dinners, canned condensed soups as cooking ingredients, instant coffee, powdered dessert mixes, packaged macaroni and cheese. The first Swanson TV dinner is sold in 1953. It is a tray containing turkey with cornbread dressing and gravy, sweet potatoes and buttered peas, designed to be heated in the oven and eaten in front of the television. It is marketed as a liberation from the kitchen for the modern American woman, and the women who buy it are not being foolish, they are being practical. After a long day, the prospect of not having to cook an entire dinner from scratch is genuinely appealing. The problem, which will not be clearly understood for decades, is not with the individual convenience product. It is with the aggregate replacement of home cooking with industrial food over time, and with the changes in food composition that accompany that replacement. The TV dinner of 1953 is made from relatively recognizable ingredients, turkey and vegetables in simple preparations, with some added sodium and a few preservatives. It is nutritionally inferior to a home-cooked meal but not radically different in kind. What develops over the following decades as food science advances and competition drives the industry to optimize products for palatability and cost and shelf life is food products that bear increasingly little relationship to the whole foods they are notionally based on. Chicken nuggets containing chicken meat mechanically separated from the carcass and mixed with binders and fillers and reformatted into uniform shapes. Breakfast cereals containing minimal whole grain and substantial added sugar and synthetic vitamins to replace the natural ones lost in processing. Snack foods engineered with specific combinations of fat, salt and sugar designed to override normal satiety signals and encourage continued eating. These products have no equivalent in the 1952 kitchen. The progression from the convenience foods of the 1950s to the ultra-processed food landscape of the 21st century is one of degrees, but it is also one of kind. The TV dinner of 1953 is convenience food, the chicken nugget of 2000 is ultra-processed food, and the distinction, which nutrition researchers have spent the past 2 decades working to articulate, is meaningful. Ultra-processed foods are associated, in epidemiological studies, with increased risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and other chronic conditions in ways that less processed foods are not, independent of their calorie and nutrient content. The 1952 woman could not have seen this coming. She bought the TV dinner because she was tired and it made a hard evening easier. She bought the packaged cake mix because it saved an hour. She bought the canned soup because it shortened a dinner preparation from hours to minutes. Each individual choice was reasonable and even sensible. The cumulative shift in the food environment, aggregate across millions of households and accelerated by the food industry's relentless optimization for palatability and profit, produced a dietary landscape that she could not have imagined and that has contributed to patterns of chronic disease that represent a genuine public health crisis. The irony is real and considerable. The women of the early 1950s, cooking from whole food ingredients according to traditional practices, were producing a daily diet of significant nutritional quality without any particular effort or intentionality in that direction. The women of the late 20th and early 21st century, surrounded by processed and ultra-processed food products, must work actively and counterculturally to achieve anything close to the nutritional standard that was the default in 1952. Now let us spend some time with the herbs and the condiments and the small flavors that animated the 1952 daily diet, because these are foods that have mostly survived in recognizable form and deserve appreciation in their own right. Mustard in a 1952 kitchen is likely ballpark yellow mustard or a similar prepared variety, but in many households there is also dry mustard powder from a tin, used in cooking rather than as a condiment. adding a sharp, pungent bite to salad dressings and deviled eggs and certain sauces. Dry mustard in cooking is a small nutritional note. Mustard seeds contain glucosinolates, which are compounds associated in research with certain cancer protective properties. Vinegar appears constantly in the 1952 kitchen. Apple cider vinegar on the shelf, used for salad dressings and pickling and as a cooking ingredient. White distilled vinegar for cleaning and for certain pickling applications. In certain households, homemade wine vinegar or cider vinegar, made by leaving hard cider or wine to continue fermenting past the point of drinkability until the alcohol converts to acetic acid. Raw apple cider vinegar, meaning unpasteurized vinegar still containing the gelatinous mass of bacteria and yeast called the mother, is used as a folk remedy in many households throughout this era for everything from sore throats to digestive upset to as a tonic drunk diluted in water. The health properties of apple cider vinegar are a topic of ongoing modest research, but its use as an acidifying cooking ingredient that aids in mineral extraction from bones and vegetables and legumes is nutritionally real regardless of its folk medicine reputation. Horseradish is another small daily flavor worth noting. Freshly grated horseradish root or horseradish preserved in vinegar appears as a condiment alongside beef and fish and in certain sauces throughout this decade. Horseradish, like mustard, contains glucosinolates and has a strong flavor that both stimulates appetite and supports digestive processes. It is a real food with real minor nutritional significance. Fresh herbs from the garden are used throughout the summer. Parsley, the universal green garnish, but also used in quantity as an ingredient rather than decoration. Chives cut fresh from the pot on the windowsill. Dill used both fresh and dried for pickles and cucumber salads. Mint for drinks and for certain lamb preparations, and occasionally in fruit salads. These herbs are not merely flavoring. Parsley is an excellent source of vitamin K and vitamin C. Chives contain various compounds that support cardiovascular health. Dill has a history as a digestive aid. Fresh herbs, used generously in cooking, are a small but consistent nutritional contribution to the daily diet. Dried herbs dominate the winter kitchen. Dried sage for the Thanksgiving stuffing and for pork preparations, dried thyme for soups and braises, dried oregano for Italian-influenced dishes that are becoming more popular through the decade as Italian-American cooking makes inroads into mainstream American food culture. Bay leaves in every pot of soup and stock. Celery seed used as a spice in certain preparations where fresh celery is not available or appropriate. These small flavors, the accumulated complexity of a well-stocked spice shelf, are part of what gives the 1952 kitchen its character. They are not just seasoning, they are tradition, passed down through cookbooks and family practice, adapted regionally and ethnically, reflecting the specific heritage of specific households. Let me turn now to something I have been circling around throughout this whole conversation, because it sits at the center of the 1950s food story in a way that I want to name clearly. The influence of advertising and food marketing on what women in the 1950s ate is enormous, and it is almost entirely in the direction of processed and packaged products. The food industry of this decade understands, with increasing sophistication, how to reach the housewife who controls the grocery purchases, and it uses every tool available to it to do so. Television advertising, as we have noted, is new and extraordinarily powerful. The product placements in magazines directed at women, in publications like Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens, carry not just advertisements, but recipes that use specific branded products, reaching enormous readerships with the message that modern cooking is cooking with specific commercial ingredients. The recipe for green bean casserole is not just a recipe, it is an advertisement embedded in a recipe, designed to sell Campbell's condensed cream of mushroom soup. The Kraft mac and cheese recipe on the back of the box is not a cooking instruction, it is the product itself, presenting a manufactured food that requires only water and milk as an equivalent to the pasta and cheese dishes that have existed for centuries. The Jell-O cookbook distributed free to consumers contains dozens of recipes for dishes that use multiple Jell-O products, creating a self-contained culinary universe in which this one company's products appear on the table in multiple forms at multiple meals. The genius of this marketing is its invisibility. It does not feel like advertising. It feels like recipes. It feels like helpful cooking suggestions from a friendly source. It normalizes the use of specific manufactured products in ways that genuine recipes built around whole ingredients never could, and it does so in the most authoritative and trustworthy medium available, the cookbook. By the early 1960s, these strategies will have reshaped the mainstream American recipe in fundamental ways. The scratch cooking instinct will increasingly be replaced by the combination instinct, the mixing and assembly of convenience ingredients rather than the transformation of whole ingredients. And the nutritional character of the resulting food, in aggregate, will have shifted in directions that are not positive. But I want to be careful here not to paint the 1950s food world as a pure golden age, because it is not. There are real limitations and genuine problems with the daily diet of the early 1950s that deserve honest acknowledgement. The variety of the daily diet for many families, particularly in winter and in regions with less agricultural abundance, is considerably narrower than the ideal. Root vegetables, stored grains, canned goods, salted and smoked meats, dried legumes, these are the foundations of the winter diet in many parts of the country, and while they are nutritious in the ways we have discussed, they lack the range of fresh vegetables and fruits that a more diverse diet would provide. Fresh citrus and certain tropical fruits are available in winter, providing vitamin C that is otherwise hard to come by in the cold months, but fresh green vegetables are largely absent from many winter diets in colder regions, replaced by canned versions that are inferior nutritionally. The reliance on salt-preserved foods, particularly in the form of cured and smoked meats and salted preserved fish, means that sodium intake in the 1952 diet is often high, though the sodium comes from different sources than modern processed food, and is generally accompanied by other minerals in the food matrix that may moderate its effects. The fat in the diet, while more naturally balanced and less artificially modified than what will replace it, is still abundant, and for families with metabolic conditions or with specific cardiovascular risk factors, this may not be ideal. Sugar consumption is rising through the decade, driven partly by the increasing availability of manufactured sweets and sweetened beverages, and this is a genuine negative trend, even if it has not yet reached the levels of later decades. The food safety standards of the early 1950s are also imperfect. Before the establishment of comprehensive federal food safety regulation, incidents of food contamination and adulteration were not uncommon, and certain practices in both commercial food production and home preservation carried risks that have since been mitigated. So the picture is complex, as pictures of the real world always are. The 1952 daily diet is better in some specific and important ways than what replaced it, and in other ways it was imperfect and limited. The honest evaluation is not that everything was better then, but that certain specific things, the predominance of whole and minimally processed foods, the regular inclusion of fermented foods, the presence of organ meats and bone broth, the seasonality and locality of produce, the absence of ultra-processed food products, represented genuine nutritional advantages that were lost in the shift to the modern food environment. Now let me take you to what I think is the most poignant part of this whole story, the place where the food connects to the larger life. The woman in the 1952 kitchen, cooking 3 meals a day from whole ingredients, maintaining a garden, making her own preserves, baking bread, putting up vegetables for winter, is performing labor of considerable skill and nutritional significance. And that labor is invisible, uncredited, and uncompensated in any form that the economy recognizes. This is not a new observation. The feminist critique of domestic labor as unpaid and undervalued work has been made thoroughly and forcefully. What I want to add to it here is a specific nutritional dimension, the labor that was dismissed and devalued, the cooking from scratch, the garden tending, the broth making, the bread baking, was also the labor that sustained the nutritional quality of the household's diet. When that labor was devalued culturally and economically, and when the food industry offered alternatives that reduced its necessity, the nutritional quality of what the household ate went with it. The promise of convenience was not entirely false. The time that women spent making broth and baking bread and tending the garden was time they could have spent doing other things, including things they valued and found meaningful. The question is whether the nutritional trade that came with the convenience bargain was ever clearly articulated or understood, and the answer is clearly no. Women were encouraged to see processed convenience foods as an upgrade, as modern and scientific and progressive, as evidence of advancement beyond the drudgery of traditional cooking. They were not told that the drudgery contained nutritional value that was not being replaced by the convenient alternative. They were not given the information they would have needed to make an informed nutritional trade. The food industry naturally had no interest in providing it. This is worth sitting with, not to assign blame, which is too simple an exercise for this complex history, but to understand what happened and why, so that the people who want to reconnect with the nutritional quality of the 1952 daily diet can do so with clear eyes about what is involved. What is involved is cooking, real cooking, from whole ingredients, with the time and skill that requires, not all the time, and not at the level of a full-time domestic enterprise. Most people today do not have the time for the 1952 version of domestic food production, and most would not want it if they did. But the basic practice of cooking soup from bones, of fermenting something regularly, of eating organ meats occasionally, of cooking dried legumes from scratch, of eating the vegetables and fruits that are actually in season, these are things that are available to anyone with a kitchen and an hour a week, and they recover something real. Let me walk you through one more area of the 1952 daily diet that I think deserves careful attention, because it is one that connects the everyday food of that decade to some of the oldest and most fundamental nutritional traditions in human eating: fermentation. We have touched on fermented foods throughout this conversation: fermented pickles, homemade yogurt, aged cheeses, sourdough bread. But let me gather these threads together and explain why the presence of fermented foods in the daily diet is not incidental but significant. Human beings have been fermenting food for at least 10,000 years, probably considerably longer. Fermentation was the primary food preservation technology before refrigeration and canning, and it produced as a byproduct foods with dramatically different nutritional and physiological properties from their starting ingredients. Fermented dairy, in the form of yogurt and kefir and aged cheese, transforms the proteins in milk into more digestible forms, converts lactose into lactic acid and shorter-chain sugars that many lactose-intolerant people can tolerate, increases the availability of certain minerals, and provides live cultures of bacteria that support gut microbiome diversity. Fermented vegetables, in the form of sauerkraut and kimchi, and fermented pickles, convert the sugars in vegetables to lactic acid, preserve vitamins that might otherwise degrade, and provide a range of lactobacillus species that are among the best documented beneficial bacteria for human gut health. Fermented grains, in the form of sourdough bread and certain traditional porridges, reduce phytic acid, improve mineral bioavailability, pre-digest some of the complex starches in grain, and produce organic acids and other compounds that affect the glycemic properties of the bread. Fermented beverages, including the hard cider that was a daily drink for many Americans before clean water was universally available, contain organic acids and, in the case of unfiltered ciders and wines, live cultures that have various physiological effects. The woman in the 1952 kitchen who is regularly eating these fermented foods is receiving a daily input of microbial diversity that most modern Americans no longer receive through their diet, and this input is not trivial. The gut microbiome, which research over the past 2 decades has established as a central regulator of immune function, metabolic health, and even mood and cognition, is maintained and supported in part by regular consumption of diverse fermented foods. The decline of these foods from the daily diet, replaced by pasteurized and shelf-stable products that provide no live cultures, is one of the specific dietary shifts that may be contributing to the increase in dysbiosis, imbalance in gut microbiome composition, and related conditions that have been documented in Western populations over the past several decades. The rise of the probiotic supplement industry, which was worth over $50 billion globally by the early 2020s, is in some sense a response to this specific dietary shift. People are paying considerable amounts of money to restore through capsules something that used to arrive naturally through the daily diet in the form of fermented foods. The supplement may help, but it is a pale substitute for the diversity and quantity of live cultures that traditional fermented foods provide, and it does not come with the other nutritional benefits of eating real fermented food. Now I want to tell you about something that might seem tangential, but is actually quite central to understanding the 1952 daily food world, and that is the role of the church supper and the community meal. Food in the early 1950s is not primarily a private or individual matter in the way that modern eating often is. It is deeply communal, connected to the social fabric of the community in ways that are inseparable from its nutritional and cultural character. The church supper is a weekly or monthly institution in most American communities of this era, Women bring dishes from their own kitchens, assembled from their own gardens and pantries, and the resulting spread is a reflection of the community's collective culinary heritage. German-American sauerkraut and sauerbraten, alongside Polish-American kapusta and pierogi, alongside Italian-American pasta dishes, alongside Southern American cornbread and collard greens, alongside New England baked beans. This diversity of dishes, reflecting the diverse ethnic and regional heritage of American communities, means that the church supper represents a kind of nutritional diversity that individual households might not achieve on their own. The Polish neighbor's fermented beet soup, eaten by someone who has never made it at home, delivers nutrients from a specific combination of ingredients and a specific fermentation tradition that would otherwise be absent from their diet. The German neighbor's rye bread, dense with whole grain and lacto-fermented over days, is something different from the white bread on most tables and delivers something different nutritionally. The communal meal is also a vehicle for the transmission of culinary knowledge. Recipes are exchanged. Techniques are demonstrated. The woman who makes the best pie in the congregation is the person you ask when your pie crust is failing. The woman who has the most productive garden is the person you ask about what to do with the squash coming in faster than you can eat it. This informal network of food knowledge, embedded in the social structures of community and neighborhood, is one of the things that sustains the culinary traditions of the early 1950s. It is knowledge that lives in practice rather than in books, transmitted by watching and tasting and asking rather than by reading. And as communities change through the following decades, as the church supper declines, and as the neighborhood network of women who cook from scratch gives way to a more atomized social structure, this knowledge base erodes. Let me say something about the grocery store itself, because the geography of the 1952 grocery is different from what we know today in ways that reflect and reinforce the dietary patterns we have been discussing. The supermarket as a concept is a product of the 1930s, and by 1952 it has largely replaced the smaller specialized shops, the butcher, the fishmonger, the greengrocer, the bakery, that characterized earlier shopping patterns. But the supermarket of 1952 is much smaller than the modern supermarket, and its contents are different in their composition. The fresh produce section contains what is in season in the region. The meat section contains whole cuts of meat and specialty items like liver and kidneys and tongue, alongside the more popular cuts. The dairy section contains milk in glass bottles, cream in glass containers, butter in waxed paper, and a limited range of cheeses. The grocery aisles contain a growing but still modest range of canned goods and packaged products, alongside bulk bins of dried legumes and grains, and the staples of scratch cooking: flour, sugar, salt, baking powder, yeast, spices. The ratio of whole food ingredients to processed products in that 1952 supermarket is dramatically different from the modern supermarket, where estimates suggest that somewhere between 50 and 70% of all calories purchased come from ultra-processed food products. In 1952, the comparable figure is considerably lower, not because people are making more virtuous choices, but because the ultra-processed products have not yet been developed or are just beginning to appear. The center aisles of the modern supermarket, where the ultra-processed products live, are in 1952 a smaller and less dominant feature of the food landscape. The periphery of the store, where the fresh whole foods are, takes up a larger proportional share of both the physical space and the shopping budget. Let me spend some time now with the specific nutritional losses that came with the rise of industrial food, because I think naming them concretely is useful. The first is the loss of dietary diversity. The traditional American diet of the early 1950s, drawing on the diverse ethnic heritage of the American population and the varied produce of local agricultural systems, included a considerably wider range of plant species and preparations than the modern diet. Studies of dietary diversity consistently show that greater variety in the foods consumed is associated with better nutritional status and greater gut microbiome diversity. The homogenization of the American diet, driven by the dominance of a small number of commodity crops and a small number of ultra-processed product formulas, has reduced this diversity measurably. The second is the loss of traditional food preparation techniques. The soaking of legumes, the making of bone broth, the long, slow braising of collagen-rich cuts, the fermentation of vegetables and dairy. These techniques, which were embedded in everyday cooking practice in 1952, are rarely performed in most modern kitchens, and their nutritional contributions are difficult to replicate through other means. The third is the loss of organ meats from the mainstream diet. This is, in nutritional terms, one of the most significant single losses. The combination of nutrients that liver and other organ meats provide is extraordinary and not easily replicated by any plant-based food or any processed supplement. The fourth is the shift in cooking fat composition. The replacement of butter and lard and bacon fat with partially hydrogenated vegetable oils and then with refined vegetable oils high in omega-6 fatty acids has altered the fat composition of the daily diet in ways that are associated with increased inflammatory signaling throughout the body. The fifth is the loss of the connection between eating and growing and cooking. The woman who grows vegetables in her garden, preserves them through summer, and cooks them through winter, has a relationship with her food that provides not just nutritional quality, but a certain kind of meaning, a way of being in connection with the natural world and with the labor of sustenance that is harder to access when food arrives from a factory in a package. These losses are real and measurable. They are also not irreversible, which is the most important thing to say about them. The foods that women ate daily in the early 1950s, the soups made from bones, the organ meats cooked simply, the fermented pickles from crocks, the dried beans soaked overnight and simmered for hours, the whole vegetables pulled from gardens and cooked fresh, the full-fat dairy from grass-fed cows, the bread leavened with wild yeast and given time to develop flavor and nutritional quality. All of these are available to anyone who chooses them. They are not nostalgic impossibilities. They are choices, not always easy choices in the context of modern life, where time is scarce and the food environment actively discourages whole food cooking by offering an infinite array of ultra-processed alternatives at every turn, but choices nonetheless. There is something both sad and hopeful in the realization that the nutritional standard that was ordinary and unremarkable in 1952, that required no special knowledge or effort beyond the traditional cooking skills of the era, is now considered nutritionally sophisticated. The bone broth that a 1952 housewife made automatically from the Sunday chicken carcass is now sold in specialty stores at significant prices as a premium health product. The fermented pickles that sat in crocks in thousands of American kitchens are now marketed as probiotic products. The grass-fed beef that was simply the default beef in 1952 is now a premium category with premium pricing in the modern market. The distance between what was ordinary then and what is considered special now is a measure of how far the standard has shifted and in which direction it has shifted. Let me tell you about one more food that I think deserves a place in this conversation, because it connects many of the threads we have been pulling at throughout this long story. Homemade soup. Not soup from a can, not soup from a packet, not restaurant soup, but homemade soup made from scratch in a large pot on a home stove, made with the intention that it will feed the family for several days and improve with each reheating. The homemade soup in a 1952 kitchen is, in many ways, the purest expression of the nutritional philosophy of the era. It is made from bones and collagen-rich connective tissue, producing gelatin. It is made from vegetables in season, providing the vitamins and minerals of the specific moment of the year. It is made from legumes, soaked and cooked from scratch, providing fiber and plant protein and minerals. It is seasoned with herbs, both for flavor and for their minor but real phytochemical contributions. It is enriched with fat, butter, or cream, or the fat that has risen to the top of the broth, which carries fat-soluble vitamins and facilitates their absorption. And it is made with time, with the slow application of gentle heat that extracts from the ingredients everything they have to give: color, flavor, gelatin, minerals, the rendered fat from the marrow, the sweet concentrated essence of carrots and onions, cooked long past the point where they would be served as vegetables. The soup that results from this process is, nutritionally and in terms of flavor, something that cannot be approximated in any quick way. It also fills the kitchen with a smell that is one of the most comforting smells a house can have. Complex and warm and savory, the smell of something being taken care of, something being made slowly and with attention. This is not merely aesthetic. The anticipation of food, the sensory engagement with food in preparation, the smell of cooking as a signal that nourishment is coming. These things have physiological effects on the digestive system, preparing it through the cephalic phase of digestion to receive and process the food to come. The industrialization of the food supply has, among its many consequences, largely eliminated this smell from American households. Dinner that comes out of a package in the microwave in 4 minutes does not fill the house with the anticipation-building, comfort-producing smell of something cooked slowly all day. And this is a small loss among the many we have discussed tonight, but it is real. Now let me bring this long, winding, deeply nourishing conversation toward a close. Not an abrupt end, but a gentle slowing, the way a long walk comes to its finish, not with a sudden stop, but with a gradual quieting of the pace. We have traveled through a day in the 1952 kitchen, from the morning eggs fried in butter to the evening pot of soup simmering on the back burner. We have visited the garden and the local farm and the butcher shop and the church supper. We have followed the stories of the foods that filled the daily diet of American women in that decade, some of which have survived in recognizable form, and many of which have quietly disappeared, replaced by products that are cheaper and more convenient and often less nutritious. What remains, after all of this, is an impression, not a prescription, not a plan, not a list of things to do differently, just an impression. An impression of a way of eating that was grounded in the physical world in specific ways, in season, in locality, in the whole bodies of animals, in the slow processes of fermentation and long cooking, in the knowledge that food was worth the time it took to prepare properly. An impression of a woman who cooked 3 meals a day from whole ingredients, not because anyone told her it was healthy, but because that is what cooking was, and who in doing so provided her family with a daily diet of nutritional quality that most modern Americans, despite all our information and all our supplements and all our dietary awareness, would struggle to match. An impression of a food world in the middle of a great transition, on the cusp of changes that would reshape what Americans ate more profoundly than any transition since the agricultural revolution, changes driven by technology and marketing and economic forces larger than any individual choice, changes whose full nutritional consequences would not be understood for decades, and an impression of possibility, of the ingredients and the techniques and the knowledge that are still available, still waiting, in the bins of dried beans and the blocks of real butter and the farmers' markets and the soup pots that sit unused in the backs of cabinets. The 1952 daily diet is not gone, it has receded. It can be retrieved, at least in the parts of it that matter most, by anyone willing to make the time. The soup pot is always there. The bones from last night's dinner are always available. The bag of dried lentils costs almost nothing and lasts in the pantry for a year. The full-fat dairy at the supermarket is there alongside the low-fat versions. The liver at the butcher is still the cheapest cut in the case. The sourdough starter can be made from flour and water in a few days. None of this requires a time machine or a full-time domestic career or a return to the particular social arrangements of the 1950s, with all their limitations and inequities. It requires only the knowledge of what was lost and the willingness to recover the parts that are worth recovering. I hope tonight gave you something of that knowledge. I hope it also gave you something softer, the feeling of having spent time in a kitchen that was warm and purposeful and full of the smells of things being cooked slowly and well. A kitchen where the food meant something, where it was connected to the soil that grew it and the hands that prepared it and the table where it was shared. That kitchen is not gone. It lives in the habits and the choices and the soups that we make or do not make, in the questions we ask or do not ask, about where our food comes from and how it was made and what it will do for us and for the people we feed. The beans are in the pantry, the bones are in the pot, the lid is on and the heat is low, and the kitchen is beginning to fill with that deep, quiet, deeply satisfying smell. There is no rush, there never was. Thank you for being here at Sleepy Old World tonight. Thank you for settling in and listening and thinking about these things with me. The comments you leave, every single one of them, are read and treasured. If this felt worth your time, subscribe and come back. There are more kitchens to visit, more worlds to sit in, more evenings to spend together in the quiet with the stories that history left behind. Sleep well tonight. And tomorrow, if you feel like it, make some soup.